So the Canon EOS R3 has had a product development announcement. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. And basically what this is Canon just came out and said, we're working on a camera. It's called the EOS R3. We call it the Tree because the Canon 3D had this weird fancy eye tracking autofocus technology, or the Canon 3 EOS 3 had eye tracking fancy technology. And they basically just came out, showed some pictures and said, we're dropping this. And some people go like, what the hell is this? What's the point of this? What are the specs it's going to have? And all that. And we're going to use Logic to figure out all the answers to those questions in this video right here. So let's go ahead. Now, first question is, why the hell was the EOS R3 product development thing announced? Well, the answer is pretty simple. A1 destroys the R5. Okay, in some aspects the R5 still wins the A1, but in many aspects, in still photo aspects, in actually usable video aspects, the A1 takes a massive crap on the R5 just for the sheer fact that you can actually use the A1 for more than 2 minutes without it melting away your fingers. And that is why the A1 kind of destroys the R5 in many aspects of things. So when Canon sees this, they're like, oh crap. People who are considering between the R5 and the A1, the two flagships, are now going to go with the A1. And also the A1, with it being so expensive, it's kind of a new price category that Canon goes like, we should be in that category. So then, to stop people from flocking to the A1, because there isn't really any competition for the A1 at this point in time, Canon drops this R3 announcement. It's basically going to, someone, to the girlfriend who is going to leave you and saying, please, give me a couple of months, I'll show you what I can do. Seriously, let me just show you what I can do. Please don't go with the other guy first. It's just basically asking for a time extension, and when Canon does that development announcement, some people who were going to buy the A1 might be like, ooh, Canon is coming back in and throwing another punch at Sony. So they might hold off buying an A1, and that's kind of the whole purpose of the announcement. They'll hold off buying the A1 just to see what the R3 brings to the table. And if you're wondering why there's so many announcements and why it keeps going on and on, it's because the Olympics keeps getting pushed back because there's a pandemic going on. So because of that, because of this pandemic, the competition, the race to build the camera that dominates the Olympics that I talked about with the Sony A1 release, I don't know if you watched that video, but this race to develop that camera that all the professionals are using in the Olympics keeps getting extended and extended and extended. It's like if you were running on the treadmill and someone just keeps adding time to the timer, or if you're running on a track and someone keeps laying out fresh tarmac on the end of the track just as you go along. Because this race keeps going on, this competition, there's more time for development, things are getting rushed, things are getting pushed forward, because both companies know that the Olympics is a key factor in kind of creating that snowball effect that helps them dominate or get more market share in terms of the camera world. I talked about this in my Sony A1 video. If you haven't checked that out, you should check it out. I think that's a pretty decent kind of opinion commentary video. Okay, so that's why the EOS R3 development was announced, why the race keeps going on. Let's talk about what I think is going to be the specs of the Canon EOS R3. Starting off with kind of the still photography features, because why not? I think the EOS R3 is going to be something that is similar to kind of figure it out. We should take a look at kind of the past performance of Canon. So let's take a look at the 5D Mark IV and the 1DX Mark II, which were the same generation and kind of in a similar position to the R5 and the potential R3 now. One is kind of a prosumer / pro camera, the R5D and the R5, that does a lot of things, but is not the most reliable and not the most effective in a pro setting. And then we have the 1DX, and the R3, which are going to be top of the line, and they have to do everything perfectly to win. So that's kind of the same situation. I see the parallels, and we're going to use what Canon did in the past to kind of figure out what Canon will do with the R3. So first and foremost, starting out with the stills performance, the 1DX series, which hasn't been replaced properly yet because they put the sensor from the 1DX Mark III into the R6, but the R6 isn't really a super high-end sports body, and the R3 clearly is going to be a very high-end sports body, is going to be the spiritual successor, the true spiritual successor to the 1DX Mark III. And the trend with 1D series cameras is that the megapixel count of them aren't that high. That way you can basically have higher burst rates because you are less restricted by data, what's it called, the speed you can write data to your cards. I would suspect that even though the Sony A1 came out with 30 FPS at 50 megapixels, I think what Canon would try to do here with the R3 is not do something that the R5 has already done with its 47 megapixels at 20 FPS, but rather instead of focusing on high megapixels, high frame rates, it will go for ultra high frame rates at pretty good megapixels. So I suspect the R3 would have something like 30 something megapixels, something that is still respectable, very competitive with the A1, and with the A1 and the R3 and all that. But it's not so high megapixels so that Canon is able to squeeze out even more FPS performance from the camera. I would suspect that Canon will come up with some crazy numbers with the R3. I highly believe that the R3 would have some sort of crazy like 45 or 50 FPS burst modes, basically taking full sensor raw video as we go along, just so that, yes, it loses to the A1 in FPS. Yes, it loses to the A1 in terms of megapixels, but it beats it heavily in frames per second, which might actually be more important to a sports photographer than actual straight up megapixels. Because even with a 30 something or 20 something megapixel image, if you crop in 100%, 150%, you still get a very nice, sharp, usable image, even on print on a newspaper or a magazine. But if you don't get enough frames per second, you might miss out the right shot, like the exact moment the guy maybe punches the other guy, or the exact moment the ball enters the net. You might not get that golden perfect shot without enough frames per second. So depending on the photographer, having high frames per second might be more important than megapixels, and I think that's the route the R3 will go, similar to the way kind of the 1DX series have went, where it's less megapixels than the 5D series or the 5DS series, but a lot more FPS because it's a sports kind of wildlife kind of camera, and because it's all about Olympics right now, I think the R3 with its sports focus will really heavily emphasize having insane FPS, better than the A1 in that way, while sacrificing some of that megapixel advantage, some of that resolution advantage. Okay, let's move on to the video side of things. What do I think is going to be the video features, the video specs on the EOS R3? Taking a look back at the 1DX and the 5D's kind of relationship, we can see that the 1DX Mark II was not that much better in terms of compared to the 5D in terms of image quality, and yes, it did have higher frame rates, but apart from that, the 1DX Mark II didn't really bring that much more to the video game than the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV, but it did bring one thing that's super important to professionals, and that is practicality, actual implementable usability that professionals can rely on. The 1DX Mark II had much better codecs than the 5D Mark IV. I think it had RAW, if I'm not wrong, and it basically brought a lot of things that it didn't really improve on image quality. It didn't have C-Log 2, C-Log 3 compared to the 5D Mark IV, but it did bring a lot of practicality. It didn't overheat, it had better media, yes, more expensive media, but better media for recording high bitrate footage. It had better codecs, it had H.264 and not just MPEG. So the 1DX Mark II was basically an evolution on the 5D Mark IV in that it didn't overheat, it was practical, had good formats, had good codecs and all that stuff. It was just a usable 5D Mark IV. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. And where I'm going with this is simply this. I think the R3 is just going to be the R5 in terms of video specs. It's going to match the R5 in terms of video specs, because I think pushing above 4K 120 is going to be very difficult with sensor technology at this point in time. Who knows? I think it's going to match the R5 in terms of video specs mostly, but with the one exception that it doesn't overheat. And that's clearly, and I think the R3 obviously has been, in the works for a long period of time, which is why I think the R5 and R6 were so bottlenecked and so nerfed by overheating in the first place. And before you say, oh, the R5 and R6 overheat because they're so powerful, that is false, because everyone who's opened up an R5 and R6 has conclusively shown that Canon decided not to cool the processors found in the R5 and R6. This was an intentional design decision to both software limit and hardware limit the R5 and R6 capabilities, because clearly there was something bigger that was coming along, and that will be, I think, the R3. To me, the R6 and R5s are failures, by the way, because they are not reliable and not a practical camera you can rely on. If the R6 came out without overheating, I would actually sell everything I have just to buy it, but it didn't come out without overheating because Canon are a little bit of pricks. So the R3 would just be, in my opinion, on the video side of things, the R5, but with less overheating. And because it's probably going to have less megapixels than the R5, as I kind of explained why I think so just now, I think it will have RAW, but it will be lower resolution RAW. Because 8K RAW requires 40 something megapixels, and if the R3 does indeed have 30 something megapixels, I think the highest resolution you can go for RAW is probably like 6 point something K, which is honestly enough. Higher than 4K is already a lot, and even 4K is plenty. So that is my prediction for kind of the R3 on photo specs, video specs, and all that stuff. In terms of price, I think it's pretty obvious to see where the price of the R3 is coming in. It's going to come in at the same, if not higher price than the Sony A1. It's the obvious competitor to the Sony A1. And obviously it will have a similar battery type to the 1DX, where it's like this big chunky battery and all that stuff. Oh, and I forgot to talk about like other video features with the R3. It's gonna have everything the R5 has. So your false color histograms, the ability to record to external recorders, all that stuff would still be found on the R3 is my prediction. Okay, and with that, I'm gonna end this video off here. If you agree with me, tell me in the comments. If you disagree with me, also tell me in the comments. I would love to know why. And if you enjoyed this little chat, this little conversation, make sure you like and subscribe, and more camera discussion videos will be coming along. I don't have that many cameras to review. I literally don't have any access to camera gear to review, so this channel won't have too many camera videos, camera reviews for now, till maybe camera brands start sending me stuff. And if you want that to happen one day with my style of discussion, make sure you subscribe, because I need this channel to grow to ever hit that level. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.